All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second to last Tuesday webinar of the semester. Let me first of all introduce my two co-moderators, Fran Agopian, who is going to say hi.
Hello, everyone.
And Alisha Holland, who's not going to say hi because she's lost her voice, but she'll wave me. I also want to thank, as usual, Pablo Ibarra and Jillian Scales for their work in making this production happen. As many of you know, Colombia is about to have, in 3 weeks, a presidential election. And I've lost my notes. And like many in the region, like many countries in the region, this election has become quite intensely polarized, with left-wing candidate Gustavo Petro and former Medellin Mayor Federico Gutierrez, who maybe not coming from the right, but is increasingly backed by the right. So we have yet another classically left-right polarized election. Now, Colombia is traditionally a pretty conservative country, so the prospects, the possibility of Petro winning the election has been a shock for some. It's struck fear in some quarters and a lot of excitement in others. I think Fran and I, who've been running the Tuesday seminar in Alisha's absence this semester, are two of the Latin Americanists in the United States with the least knowledge combined of Colombian politics. So we are very, very fortunate to have with us three terrific young scholars of Colombian politics. Before I introduce them and they present, let me just do a couple of housekeeping bits. First of all, we are recording today's event and we'll have recordings available on the Dr. Cuss YouTube channel shortly after. Secondly, there is Spanish language translation available. Just go to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, if you have questions, we would love to hear them. Well, not actually hear them, we'd love to read them. The chat function is shut down, but at any time during the presentation, if you've got a question for any of our panelists, just submit your question through the Q&A function. And Fran and I will take up the questions in the Q&A period. So at any time, you don't have to wait until the end. If you've got a question, just send it on and we will do our best to get them to the panelists. Okay, for introductions, we've got three terrific panelists today, and I'm going to introduce them in their order of appearance. Juan Pablo Milanese is going to lead off and give an overview of the election process. He's professor in the Department of Political Studies at the Universidad ICESI in Colombia. He has published widely on a variety of topics related to elections, political parties, executive legislative relations, and especially electoral rules and their consequences in Colombia. Juan Pablo, it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks for coming. Our second speaker will be Silvia Otero, who is assistant professor in the School of International, Political, and Urban Studies at the Universidad del Rosario in Bogotá. She earned her PhD just a few years ago in political science from Northwestern University, where she wrote a terrific dissertation entitled "When the State Minds the Gap, the Politics of Subnational Inequality and Social Development." She's now working on several different research topics, one of which really interesting, entitled "Rebel Roads," looks at the hundreds of roads that the FARC built or sponsored in its areas of operation during the guerrilla war. She's also doing a study on what's called divergent urban inequalities, which asks about the divergent trajectories of income inequality in 4 distinct Colombian cities. And finally, is doing a study on, participating in a broader study on subnational policies for containment of COVID-19 in Latin America. Silvia, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
And third, last but certainly not least, is Mónica Pachón, who's associate professor in the design department of the Universidad de los Andes. She is a political scientist who has published extensively on electoral systems, on ballot design, on executive legislative relations, both in Colombia and in Latin America more broadly. It is a great pleasure to have all three of you here today. Each speaker is going to go for roughly 10 minutes, and that should give us a fair amount of time for questions and for conversation. So we will lead off with Juan Pablo.
Okay, thank you very much. I first want to thank the organizers for inviting me to the seminar. It's a pleasure to me to be with you today. Today, I will give a brief analysis of the Colombian electoral situation based on the result of the primaries held on Saturday, Sunday, March 13. The first step is to present the major presidential candidates, and we can highlight two of them, Gustavo Petro and Federico Gutierrez. We can go to the next slide, please. In Petro's case, this is the third time he runs for president. In his first attempt back 2010, he obtained around 10% of the votes in the first electoral round. Even though he could not pass to the second, the result placed him in the race for mayor of Bogotá. The second time in 2018, he was the first left-wing candidate to reach the second round, challenging Duque for the presidency. Finally, in 2022, is his third attempt. However, this time, his strategy seems to have changed significantly, unlike his previous attempts. This time, Petro is not using a strictly left-wing coalition. On the contrary, he opted for a strong diversification of leaders and electoral support. In other words, he renounced to homogeneity to be more competitive. In gathers from traditional leftist forces, such as the Polo Democrático, to leaders who passed through Uribismo and Santismo, such Armando Benedetti and Roy Barreras, and from homophobic pastors, such Alfredo Sade, to environmentalist leaders belonging to ethnic minorities like Francia Marquez. In fact, he seems to have taken note of what happened 4 years ago, perceiving that under the current condition of Colombian politics, winning a presidential election only with the leftist vote is almost impossible, especially considering that it is necessary to achieve an absolute majority to attain the presidency. The second runner is Federico Gutierrez. Despite not being launched by the government party, he's the candidate of the social and parties coalition that support the government, in this case, a conservative one, which nowadays is a handicap. Of Uribista origin, he was mayor of Medellin, elected through the Green Party. And it is another example of the low relevance that parties have, especially from the subnational point of view, where they operate as franchises. As we conclude in a paper with Juan Albarracín, local and regional electoral dynamics are significantly decoupled from national politics, and despite the existence of the same party labels across all levels of government, we show that political parties are secondary actors in the subnational arena, whose central purpose is to satisfy legal requirements for candidate nominations. Much lower in the surveys and losing ground are Sergio Fajardo and Rodolfo Hernández. The first is an exponent of the centrist forces, and the second is an outsider representative of anti-political position. It's worth noting that part of their fast loss of support, although it appears to be fundamentally associated with social reason, is not exempt from institutional explanation. In fact, in this election, for the first time, all the main political trends held primaries to elect their candidates, producing a dynamic of 3 electoral rounds. It should have produced a sequential process of sincere and strategic voting. However, surveys indicate that the process of establishing a prevailing strategic vote would be accelerating for the first round. Concentrating precisely on the primary election result, it is indisputable that Petro's victory was resounding. The Pacto Histórico, Petro's coalition, surpassed the Equipo por Colombia, Gutierrez coalition, by more than 1.5 million votes, and can be seen in the maps. It prevailed in a significant part of the country. As can be seen in the maps, blue and light blue here, results, it is in this, and light blue represent votes of less than 10 up to 20% of the total votes cast for the 3 primaries. Yellow between 20 and 40, meanwhile light oranges are voting that range around 40%. Finally, the increase of the intensity of the orange is associated with values above 50%, reaching up 100%. Resuming the initial thread, it is easier to point out those regions where Petro did not predominate, that was those where was victorious. In this case, the case of Antioquia, traditional refractory to the left vote, Boyacá, electoral stronghold of Carlos Amaya, candidate of the coalition de la Esperanza, and Caribbean departments such Atlantic or Magdalena, controlled by Alex Char, candidate of Equipo por Colombia. Moreover, how departments such as Huila, close to Uribismo in recent decades, vote predominantly for Petro. The question arising is whether candidates like Char or Amaya, both the faith in the primaries, will have the capacity and willingness to transfer their vote to candidates like Gutierrez or Fajardo, respectively. Evidence collected in interviews with similar leaders has shown that this is not especially easy for the presidential election, in which the electorate tends to behave much more autonomously than in the rest of the elections. For example, intermediaries associated with a Valle del Cauca great elector told us how they managed to get their followers to vote for their legislative or subnational candidates, but they were unable to endorse them to the presidential candidate they supported 4 years ago. Another example, a Caucan candidate from Cambio Radical, a party that supported Duque in the second round of 2018, lines up openly behind Petro. Since his supporters has clear preferences for this candidate, he feared that if he did not support Petro, they will stop following him. Something similar could happen in the widely discussed case of the Liberal Party. Despite the speculation, it does not seem too simple that achieves a cohesive behavior based exclusively in the orders of its president Cesar Gaviria. The support for one or for any other candidate depends also on the regional dynamics. In fact, the leaders of political machines and other regional or local political organizations are the center of subnational election politics and cannot be fully understood as following a partisan lens. It is also interesting to have in mind that departments that 4 years ago were resistant to Petro of the Coffee Triangle, the result this time were more even because his remarkable performance in departmental capitals. In fact, the large urban centers were crucial spaces for the electoral performance of the Pacto Histórico. It is not surprising, especially if we consider that they were the main stages on the social protests and riots on April and May. Within this framework, cases such as Cali and Bogotá, the main bastion of petrismo, can stand out above the rest. Other urban areas in regions like Magdalena Medio played a crucial role in the performance of the Pacto. However, its predominance was not limited exclusively to this type of district. On average, it extends most of them, regardless of the socio-demographic characteristic. We can change to the next slide. Although it is worth noting that the broad support received in many peripheral municipalities has been slight effect on the aggregate that data from a national point of view. We can see the next slide, please. In fact, except for the Department of Boyacá and several of those of the Caribbean, the electoral performance of Petro primary tended to increase strongly, unlike what happened with Equipo Colombia, which experienced the opposite effect in comparison with the Gran Consulta por Colombia led by Duque 4 years ago. As can be seen on the map, the darker the blue, the loss of the vote will closer to 100% percentage points, while the opposite can be seen at the more intense red. Furthermore, as I point out, the increase and particularly the decrease in the right-wing coalition happened regardless of the type of the municipality. If we can see the next slide, it is evident. Thank you. And to conclude, although the result of the primaries are not perfect predictors, I believe that they gave us a relatively accurate idea of how the electoral process can continue. Although as of today, it seems unlikely that Petro will win in the first electoral round, the wide margin he has over his contenders is significant and seems complex to overcome. However, it's still difficult to predict how the electorate that did not vote in March intends to do so in May, or how the electors of Fajardo and Hernandez will realign themselves, and if they will do so if a possible second round, as the theory would predict, or will opt for Pedro Gutierrez during the first one, as seems to be happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. Our second speaker is Silvia Otero.
Right, yeah, no, I'm sharing the screen. Thank you very much, Juan Pablo, for your interesting presentation. I realize that we have some overlapping maps, and that's great. We got similar results. So let me show you my screen. Are you seeing it correctly? Looks good? Okay. Yeah. So today I will be talking about how this election of 2022 marks the end of what has been Colombian central or master cleavage, and how this structural change helps explain the recent results of the primaries that Juan Pablo introduced, and foresee what will happen also in the first round of presidential elections in May. So first, I want to discuss how the peace-conflict cleavage in Colombia faded away. It started to, it's getting a very fast speed erosion. For several decades and continuously from at least 1998, Colombian presidential election has revolved around the peace-conflict cleavage. All the front runners of all these elections had opposing views on how to deal with the Colombian armed conflict. And this was the central issue of all these elections. In some presidential bids, the options were doing war versus starting or continuing a peace process. And in other bids, the main issue was how to wage war with which degree of human rights violations. But as we can see in this chart made with La Pop data, from 2009, conflict stopped being considered the most prominent problem Colombians face. We can see that in 2012, right here, which was the year in which the public phase of the peace agreement between Santos and the FARC started, conflict was the main problem for only 15% of the respondents. It was a very low point. And this trend has been reinforced in the two surveys after the peace agreement was finished. In 2018 and 2020, other topics such as corruption, the economy, and health surpassed conflict as the main problem according to respondents. Oops. So in fact, the signature of the peace agreement with FARC has played a very important role in putting the peace conflict cleavage to rest. For decades, the public debate was eclipsed and captured by the conflict issue. But for the short peace of 2017 and 2018, right after the signature of the peace agreement allowed Colombians to realize that their problems were not suddenly solved with the end of the conflict. So they started to pay attention to other things. Now, in addition to this, for decades, social mobilization was dismissed, stigmatized, repressed by the state as an expression of guerrillas' power. So with the reincorporation of the FARC in 2017, social mobilization was dismissed. This argument of stigmatization and that the mobilization was part of a guerrilla power was less effective in keeping people at home. Protest calls started to reach massive audiences. And in 2019 and 2021, Colombia had massive explosions of citizen discontent. And so the conflict is still there, but psychologically there was a transition. So this allows us to understand what happened in the 2022 primary elections. So there are three main takeaways that Juan Pablo already mentioned. The right is the main loser. We thought that the center was the main loser because is the primary that got the less of the votes. But the reality is that the one that is losing more ground is the right. So I'm going to refer to these three things, and this is, I am going to talk about the results of a preliminary research that I am conducting with my colleagues Sandra Otero and Laura Garcia. So the first thing is the demise of the right. So for years, the natural and logical actor that was very successful at capitalizing the centrality of the conflict issue was the right, who could offer a mano dura policy approach. But as the peace and conflict is no longer at the center of Colombians' preoccupation, then the right has been incapable of offering other things in the policy plate that Colombians want to eat in 2022. And this is showing in the polls very dramatically. So here, right here, we can see a chart of the departments, the share of the vote that Iván Duque, the right president, got in 2018 in the first round, and what the right-wing primary got in 2022. And as we can see, the blue bars are always lower than the red bars. So it shows that the right is losing a lot of ground in most departments of Colombia. This map is very similar to what Juan Pablo showed. This is a sort of a heat map that shows how in blue shades, there is a larger share of the vote in 2022 with respect to 2018. So more blue means that each of these forces is gaining, and more orange is that each of these forces is losing. So as we can see in this map right here, there is a lot of orange for the right. So they are losing in many, many departments. And what Juan Pablo was mentioning is very important. The Andean core, which is shown in this other map, the blue area, which it was the area in which Iván Duque won. So the Andean core are the strongholds of the right, and it is exactly the parts of the country in which the right is losing a lot of ground. So this means that it seems that it's the time of the left. This structural change of the central cleavage erosion has opened a unique opportunity for the emergence of an option to the left of the ideological spectrum. These were the candidates of the left primary. The winner was Gustavo Petro. The second place was for Francia Marquez, and Petro is the presidential candidate, and Francia Marquez is the vice presidential candidate. And Petro is putting like new issues on the debate. So it's no longer conflict. If we are talking about pension reform, fiscal policy, and economic reform. things that had never been were never the central issue of Colombian presidential elections for at least 2 decades. So this map right here shows which municipalities got more than 50% of the votes for one of the primaries. So in orange are the areas in which Gustavo Petro and the left primary got more than 50% of the vote. So as we can see, most of the country is orange, and blue is the right. It's only a minority of municipalities. They are very geographically concentrated in the 3 areas from where the 3 participants of that primary belong: Antioquia, Córdoba, and Atlántico, and the other municipalities of the Caribbean. And the Andean core is much more disputed now than it was 4 years ago. So just to finish up, this leaves us with a few questions of what will happen in the first round. The main question is whether Federico Gutierrez will capture the votes for Char and Barguil, which were the other candidates of the right, especially in left-leaning Caribbean, because as we can see here, the Caribbean is split between municipalities in which Petro wins and municipalities in which the right wins. And the other question is if the left will maintain and enlarge its growth, especially in the newly disputed Andean core. And lastly, where besides Santander, which is right here, I will show you here, Santander, will be the strongholds of anti-establishment candidate Rodolfo Hernandez, or whether he will take a share of the vote of the Andean core. So these are like the main 3 questions that will be solved in the first round of elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our third speaker is Monica Pachón.
Hello, thank you so much for this invitation. Are you listening to me okay? Great. So thank you for my colleagues for these presentations. I am not going to present slides, but I'm going to talk about the March elections and the consequences of these March elections for the first round of presidential elections. In March, 48% of the voters turned out to vote. That means that we're missing maybe 12% of the electorate that can turn out to vote into 2019 in the mayoral elections. 60% of the average voters were present in the election, turned out in the election. So we're still missing a bunch of people that could change the electoral results. What happened in March 13th? First, we saw that there's a persistence of the party fragmentation. As Juan Pablo was saying, it is important to understand that the Colombia's political, electoral system is very proportional. We have a national Senate, and so we have a very fragmented political system right now, with a difference in terms of who won the election. Of course, as Silvia was saying, the Centro Democrático, the government, the party in government failed, and it had a big amount of losing votes, in part because Uribe was not there. Losing Uribe for the Centro Democrático, the former president from 2002 to 2010, is a big game changer in the March election. We have the consolidation of independent movements, as Juan Pablo was saying. Also, parties do not matter as much. We have a lot of coalitions, and the system not only introduces these parties, but also these coalitions. And in fact, Pacto Histórico is a coalition, it's not a party. Looks more like a, group of social movements instead of a party. We don't see an organization. There is no primary within the Pacto Histórico to choose candidates. They have a closed list. So it's the first time, I think, that the left chooses the best possible electoral strategy, and that it results in a very high participation and number of seats. Oh, I forgot to put my watch. Please, somebody tell me if I'm getting over my time.
You're okay so far.
Thank you. I think the election, as Silvia was saying, is not about peace or war anymore, but it's about Petro, and Petro is the center of the election. So this idea of the Pacto Histórico presenting closed lists for the House of Representatives, the Senate, and being in the consultas, where everybody knew Petro was going to win, yet despite he, presented himself in the consulta to be counted and to take advantage of the electoral system as the rules exist, made it for and against Petro, right? And it is true that the Centro Democrático failed, but I would like to question the fact that despite the fact that the Centro Democrático failed, I think the status quo coalition may not. And I think this is why Federico Gutierrez increases his support so dramatically after the March election. That's one of the questions that Alisha sent us, saying, why is it, how come somebody who's, in 5% of the intention of the vote suddenly becomes, the second viable candidate with 24% of the vote? The reason is that we have in Congress a coalition that is center-left, that is opposition, and then we have a coalition that is center-right. And this coalition in the center-right needs a viable candidate, and they found one, and they decided, to go for him. And in the surveys, we see that job. So Federico Gutierrez went from 6% to 22% in a week, right, after the March election. So if we look at Iván Duque in the 2018-2022 presidential bid, he went from 6.2 to 22% in the same moment, and later on he climbed to 40%, 3 weeks later. So we still have a status quo coalition that is arguing that Petro is not about peace or war, but it's about liberal democracy against a populist regime. And this is something that is being all the time discussed in the political system. So what do we have to look for in the first round of elections? I think we need to understand the gap between Petro and Federico Gutierrez, if he's going to be the second candidate, because this gap will tell us how viable Federico Gutierrez is in the presidential bid for the second round, and it will give us a signal of what are the other candidates going to do. Sergio Fajardo has, an electorate which is older and a little bit more conservative, but it has some remains that could go to Petro, right? And Rodolfo Hernández may have also voters that can go to the more status quo type of electorate, given the survey data that we have currently. So I think we have to look into that margin. What the candidates are trying to do right now is to close the margin, of course. There has been a lot of scandals recently on the Pacto Histórico with, illegal alliances, question candidates at Córdoba, all the relationship with FARC and other groups. But as the surveys show, it's voting for the Pacto Histórico is up is an act of basically faith. So if the when voters are asked who do they what party do they identify with, they say Pacto Histórico, 99% the ones that vote for Petro, meaning that this party identity doesn't exist really, because Pacto Histórico is Petro's personalistic movement towards the presidency, and he has changed systematically his party ID for each election, and this is not the exception in this election. So we have voters for Petro that are young, mostly young, lowest income, but we also have a lot of Petro voters that are in the middle income and high income bracket. And I think this is going to be hard for the right to convince certain certain voters. Petro has a very intense win in the Atlantic coast. In Bogotá, it's amazing the amount of voters that are voting for Petro. And for the first time, they are stronger in Antioquia. And I think this is important to understand because in a way, lots of people in Colombia would say, okay, Federico Gutierrez may not win the first round, but all voters will go, all voters, there's a ceiling for Petro, and this ceiling will not be able to, he will not be able to get above 45%, and he's another Duque, right? Because Duque went from 6% to 52%. And this is something that I think we should question at this point, because in what we are seeing in the polls is that he's going up and not necessarily down. And there's some Fajardo voters who may go to Petro and also Rodolfo. So there's a lot of uncertainty about these voters. And again, we don't know how many people are going to vote. And I think one of the things to look for is the new voters, right? If we have a 47% participation rate in elections for the legislative election, we should expect more participation for the presidential election. And so this is something that I think will be decisive for the second election. Protests were very important for Petro, and I think there's a lot of exogenous shocks that can happen from now till the election that can bust this cleavage of protest and social policy that Silvia was mentioning, inequality, corruption, and all these issues that Petro is using. And finally, from the March election, I think it's important to understand that none of the presidential candidates have it easy. So, if we woke up on March 14th thinking everybody has a difficult time governing in Colombia, because if previously all the governments had to build multi-party coalitions, Petro adding all the possible legislators that all the legislators that have been recently changing sides to choose one coalition or the other. In Colombia, we have to declare ourselves part of the government, independent or in the opposition. A lot of legislators are free to choose whomever they want to support. And so this, summing up the electoral results from March, plus the recent alignment, Petro is not able to build the majority, and Federico Gutierrez is able to build a very, very slight majority. And because of this infight, the new constituencies on peace, like circunscripciones transitorias de paz, there are 16 seats for that. And the FARC seats will become very, very pivotal, as well as the special constituencies of indigenous and Afro constituencies will become very important in forming the majority or consolidating a simple majority for either of them. I do think this is going to be a very difficult situation for either Petro or Federico Gutierrez if he wins, because social movements, the Pacto Histórico as a social movement has elected a lot of seats in the House and in the Senate. Let me just check the number. 20 seats in the Senate and 31 seats in the House of Representatives. If we add the ones that are for coalition, plus the potential additions will make the system difficult to govern. But also we have a low re-election rate in the House of Representatives. We have 30%, which I think is the lowest in the recent history, in 2 decades. We have more or less a re-election rate of 40, 45% for the House, and in the Senate, we have 45, 50%, and we have in the Senate 47%, and in the House, we're going to have 70% of new House members. So this is going to create a lot of instability, I think, for any government that comes and wants to translate this result in the primary in the first round of elections to promises, electoral promises, and things that they can and cannot do. But so yeah, that's the end. And the other questions that Alisha sent to us were so difficult. I think it's very difficult to answer how will Federico will govern and if he is different from the right. I think he is. I think he's saying, I'm not going to discuss about the peace process. I'm not, I'm very liberal in very many ways. And he wants to differentiate himself from the right wing, centro democrático, conservative values, but that it remains to be seen what he will do when he comes to government. If he wins, right?
Okay, thank you, Monica. Let's go to some questions from the audience. I'm gonna give you guys a small handful of questions. You should each take the questions that you feel fit to answer, don't feel required to answer them all. If you could each take, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes to answer them. We'll go in the order, let me throw out the questions, then we'll go in the order that you spoke. And then hopefully we'll do a second round that Fran will lead. A bunch of questions about Petro, not surprisingly. It sounds, his trajectory sounds a lot like Lula's in Brazil, starting off at a more radical left, losing a series of presidential elections, eventually moderating and building a broader front. Interestingly, a lot of Colombians, at least on the right, don't seem to buy it. I was just at an event last night where a newly elected Colombian senator insisted that Colombia was, if Petro wins, Colombia is going to become the next Venezuela. So I guess one question is, has the fear factor around Petro declined? To what extent has it declined compared to previous elections? And if so, why? Has his strategy been successful, or is it really maybe not declined? A second question Monica touched on, but I guess I want to push a little further, also from the audience, is given the fragmentation in Congress, given that it's very unlikely that Petro will be able to build a robust majority, will he be able to carry out his program? And what will be his strategies? What's the model here? Is it Lula? Is it Correa? What does Petro do with decades of demands, finally winning, if he wins, finally win the presidency, and then doesn't even have a majority in Congress? How do you expect him to handle that? And the third question, and I will stop, gets to Silvia's, one of Silvia's point, which is the decline of the right. the three of you entirely agree on that question, but to the extent that the right has weakened electorally, what accounts for that? Is this simply a story of incumbency? I mean, incumbents across Latin America, left, right, and center are weakening, or is it more than that? Is the right in some kind of a distinctive problem in Colombia today? We'll start with Juan Pablo.
Okay, I'm going to take advantage of the simultaneous translation to speak in Spanish, which I feel more comfortable with, please. A ver, yo empezaría...
Actually, I would start by saying and answering that question about the Congress, because I think there's a crucial topic when you talk about how to governability, right? Because my reading in that sense of legislative elections is that in Colombia, there wasn't a structural change from the viewpoint of the dynamic of fragmentation for the Congress, but on the contrary, what happened was a change of the scales of power. Colombian Congress is extraordinarily fragmented. No one has a majority, nor can get to the majority or close to the strongest parties, which are around 20% of representation in the legislative sense. And that, becomes like a structural break, when you talk about political agendas and their development. And I think that faced to an eventual win from Petro, we would be facing obstacles in the Congress, in essence, like any new president that would take charge in Colombia. Essentially, what he has to do is to build a coalition that would be heterogeneous, and eventually it has to take him out of his comfort zone when you talk about public policies. And careful, because that we see it from the electorate viewpoint, because Pietro learned from what happened 4 years ago, and today he doesn't have a coalition. I mean, essentially from the left, but not essentially only from the left. And I think that is a relevant topic we have to take into account. And then if we see his impetus of political preference that makes him clash with the Congress, that would lead us to mobilizations. And that's another scenario that he could see. But I don't think that Petro necessarily, the Congress is going to be constituted as an obstacle for many of his public policies. Now, there's a key issue that I think it's important to highlight, that these elections are not highlighting. We are seeing a movement towards the left, the voters in Colombia, and actually what's happening is that it's moving to the left with the national agenda, but probably what we're going to see is a right movement for next year in localities. And that what leads me to have an intuition about this. I had an impression that when the axes of the agenda are directly associated to redistribution, the left in Colombia isn't able to create a balance when it comes to their speech. But when they speak about safety or security, that happens always. And today, when you start seeing the agenda of most of the big cities in Colombia, what we find out is that security, and that's a topic that's predominant. So if there isn't significant change regarding that, maybe next year we'll find a scenario that will be quite different to the one we're facing today, especially if we take into account an element that for us is crucial in national politics in Colombia and subnational politics. They have parallel, roads. you know, subnational politics and, you know, national politics have different paths. And we've seen that in the legislatives, you know, these are regional elections, moreover than they have a national circumscription in the Congress. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I will take, since I discussed at large the question, the aspect of the right, my position in this is that the right is getting weaker electorally, but it is not only an outcome or a result of a particularly bad incumbency by President Iván Duque, who has been quite a bad president, and his all the polls, all the surveys show that he is losing a lot of support. He has been losing a lot of support. So, but it goes beyond that. I think it's in addition to that, it has to do with the fact that since conflict and peace is no longer the central thing, the right is super lost. I was like very strict at listening to the debates during the campaign for the primaries. And in every single debate between the different candidates of the right, it was clear that there was no issue, no central issue. They were speaking about every possible thing and in very superficial ways. So in my opinion, I see the right as having lost focus or lost north. It is not clear for them what is going to be the topic that is going to ignite a fire in the electorate. And it is even less clear what can they offer to that electorate. And it is particularly concerning something that Monica mentioned, that the young voters, they are not going to vote for the right. The right seems to be losing the young people. So that is something that that has happened in other Latin American countries. Maybe Colombia is for the first time joining Latin America. It's the first Latin American election that Colombia is having in quite some time. So I think that the demise of the right or the decline of the right is beyond a problem of incumbency. Now, regarding the question of how do we place Petro if he looks more than like Lula or than Correa, I think that the main concern for many Colombians with respect to Petro is less the policy aspects. There is a feeling or an emotion that there is a need of transformation, right? Like Colombians want things to change finally because things are like as they have always been. So there is this feeling of stagnation and the people want change. And policy-wise, the left has been super capable of offering that. So the problem is less about the policy things and it's more about the charisma of Petro, his personal attributes, the uncertainty of how will he govern, if he will actually be able to conform a team of people that he will keep for 4 years, of if this is going to be a constant change of ministers or other major leaders of this coalition. So the concerns, of course, for a portion of the electorate are policy-wise, but for another big chunk of the electorate, it's less policy and more about Petro's personality.
Thanks. Monica?
Okay, so I'm in an open office space. I hope you can hear me and not be wondering about the other voices. There are 3 questions. One of the things that I wanted to tell Silvia about the comparison between the primaries of 2022 and the presidential election of 2018 is that I think they have very different logics. And if you look at Iván Duque, he had 6% of the intention of the votes in 2018 in March, and then very, very fast, he became very popular in the polls, 25, 30, 40%, even like maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks previous to the first round of elections. So I would suggest that the comparison is with the primary elections of 2018, because making the argument that the right, and this is one of the things that I want to suggest. I don't think here we're talking about a right. That's why I was mentioning a pro-status coalition. We have, voters that are from, we have the Conservative Party, we have El Partido de la U, we have, Centro Democrático, we have Cambio Radical, Partido de la U, Partido Conservador. They are, regional parties have very big names within regions, but they don't have big national names. Centro Democrático has a big national name. Partido Verde has a big national name. So we can talk about ideology there, but conservatives do not have ideology. Partido de la U doesn't have an ideology. I even would say Cambio Radical is not a stronghold for ideology. So what I would say is that they're very scared of Petro. So to answer your first question, fear for Petro, I think they are very scared about Petro winning the election. They're scared about the possibility of instability, institutional instability. The promises Petro does every day are troublesome, and there is an intention of the status quo, a coalition, taking advantage of what is going on in the region, saying careful with Chile, right? Careful with the Constitutional Assembly of Chile, and look what is happening to Boric, look what is happening to Peru. Let's not engage ourselves in radical change, because it's not going to take us anywhere. So I do think that there is fear for Petro, that this fear for Petro is a main driver of support for Federico Gutierrez. Federico Gutierrez has never taken a picture in this election with Álvaro Uribe, yet 80% of the Centro Democrático voters will say they will support him, and 90% in the second round. So it's, and the others will say they won't vote for anyone, or they will vote for Rodolfo Hernández, which we know he doesn't have the chances of getting to the second round, right? So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, there is an anti-left coalition. We have here, the system is pro-government and anti-government. There is an anti-system feeling behind Petro, which people are very fearful about. And this is why the election is polarized. And this is why Sergio Fajardo is not engaging in this discussion, and is losing ground, fantastically, before everybody's eyes. And I do think that one of the things that is going to happen, of course, is that this fear will translate in a very difficult situation in the legislature. But as Juan Pablo said, this is typical in Colombia. I'm just sharing my screen to show you the parties in the governing coalition for the recent years. And as you see, it's a multi-party coalition all the time, right? But if you look at the coalition for the pro-government coalition, you have Centro Democrático, Conservative Party, Partido de la U, Cambio Radical, Colombia Justas Libres. These are the parties that are always, in the center right government coalition. But if you look at President Juan Manuel Santos, the difference is the Liberal Party, really. So this Liberal Party, that is a regional party that has a national leader, that is Cesar Gaviria, is very fundamental right now, because it means giving governability to one candidate or the other. So if Federico Gutierrez wants to govern, he needs the Liberal Party. And if Petro wants to govern, he needs the Liberal Party as well. So there's a pivotal role for him. And I think this is going to be one of the most important things that happens after the first round, which is the Liberal Party will puts put the cards and the value of their position. And depending, as I said, on the margin of winning between the Petro and Federico, we will see if people think Federico Gutierrez can still win the second round. This is, I think, the problem, right? That for the first time, Petro is entering elections with a margin that is higher than 10% between the right and the left. And this is going to be hard, because in our imagination for the last 20 years, the right, or at least the pro-status quo coalition is 60%, and the left will not be more than 40. So I think that is the infight that we're seeing right now, and the fear is the driving force, of course, of getting people that are non-part of a coalition become part of a coalition.
Thanks. I pass the baton to Fran.
Okay, Steve, thank you. We have really time for only this round, and I'll toss out a few more questions. And then if you could keep your answers to about 3 minutes, we'll be able to finish on time. So as Steve invited you, just answer whichever question you want. So first, I'd like to pick up on a couple of questions that Santiago Arria asked in the question and answer function. So Santiago asked a question that I had also, and that is, Steve outed both of us at the very beginning that we are not experts on Colombia. So I thank you for your presentations, because I learned so much today. And Alisha has made heroic efforts to get me to, she's giving me reading lists about Colombia because I've wanted to learn more. So I'm trying to catch up, but here's a question about Colombia in comparative Latin American perspective. Steve sort of asked this question, and he likened Colombia to Brazil, but I wonder if Brazil is the right model here, and if the model might not be Chile. So let me explain this. So in Brazil in 2002, Lula moderated, but he moderated by making a commitment to the Brazilian people on policy, what kind of fiscal policy he would follow. He did not moderate by inviting other parties into a pre-electoral coalition. Of course, he invited other parties into his government to form a majority after the election, but it was the moderation of the party itself. What you have told us is that Petro's coalition is a coalition of social movements. It's not even a coalition of parties. So one of your introductions, you were telling us a very interesting story about the fact that people were no longer, I think it was Silvia's presentation, that because people were looking away from the war-peace cleavage, they started noticing that they didn't have healthcare, protests exploded in cities, and these are the places where Petro has picked up, or the Paton has picked up support. So I'm kind of curious about what we are seeing in Colombia, and what does it look like in Latin American context? Does it look like people are just angry at policies that are not delivering to them, and they are willing to take a chance on the left and on Petro? Or are we looking at a situation of polarization? I see these as different. If there were truly polarization, I'm not sure the liberals could swing the election. So I'm kind of curious how we think about what Colombia looks like in Latin American perspective. Shanti's second question was related to this, and that was about the organization. So he's asking whether Petro is building a party organization. Is the left strengthening itself organizationally? Is it connecting to social movements? Or is it just sort of benefiting from anger that people have, or a feeling of not being represented, who belong to social movements? What can you tell us about partisanship in contemporary Colombia? Is partisanship down? Do we have a rejection of parties in general? or just a genuine shift in position? I think there's a difference between polarization and de-alignment, and I'm kind of interested in where that sits. And a second question is about, I want to follow up on and that question ties to another one we had from the audience about whether people identify as centrists or whether ordinary voters, or they identify as leftists or they identify on the right. And so how do we think about voters in relation to parties? And then I guess the very last thing that I just want to toss out is people are curious about how Petro would govern if he won. And first of all, we'd like to pin you down. The audience would like to know whether none of you think that Petro can actually win. That somehow Gutierrez will come through this in the second round and will pick up enough endorsements to win. So first of all, is there a chance Petro wins? If there is a chance, there are different kinds of lefts in Latin America. We had a session a couple of weeks ago about the red left and the green left. We have an old left, but we also have a left that's concerned with the environment, with extraction. We have a left that's concerned with postmodern issues. We have Lula might have moderated, but at no time did he make a pact with homophobic pastors. What is it that we can expect? How does Petro juggle these different pieces of the left? How does he present something that does not look like Hugo Chavez, but that can put forward a program? What are the policies you would expect a Petro government might prioritize, maybe simply because they could get done? And with that, I will stop. And again, if you can limit your answers to 2 to 3 minutes, that would be wonderful. And again, thank you. Sorry, we start with Juan Pablo.
I have to think first. I don't know if Silvia or Monica want to start.
Okay,
I can start if you want.
go, Monica.
I would say the analogy of Partido de los Trabajadores in Brazil is not quite it. I would say that the PT had a strong partisan organization. It was participating in elections. It was winning in local elections. This is a personal candidacy. The Pacto Histórico is not a party. It's a personal endorsement for a personal candidacy. I don't think we can argue that there's clear left in Pacto Histórico. I think there's a discourse that reclaims a lot of social policy and issues, but I would say that his discourse is a populist discourse, and I do think that this is something that we can analyze extensively, but to the extent that of my opinion, we don't see here a party. And this is something that worries a lot of people, because when Gustavo Petro was a mayor, his core system of support left him 6 months into the mayor, cuando era, no sé cómo decirlo, cuando era alcalde, right? After his election, because he was unable to negotiate
when he was
into his period, right? So he was unable to negotiate. He was unable to delegate. People were not happy with this type of thing, right? If you want to find an analogy for the PT, I would say Partido Verde would be the analogy, but with a big difficulty, which is being Claudia, the mayor of Bogota, having a party, organization, participating in elections, a big organization. It got destroyed in this election. It just, Sergio Fajardo is the big loser in this type of election, because parties here, and this is what I'm going to finish with this. People vote for different parties for each election. There is extensive evidence of that, because we have ballots that are per office, And so people vote for the Senate in one party, for the chamber, for the House of Representatives, another party, and they vote for the presidency, another party, right? We don't have a party ID. This is the brilliance, the brilliant thing about Pacto Histórico's strategy, which is give one shortcut of information for everybody to make the same decision for each of the candidates. But we have a very highly personalistic system in which people do not get attached to parties, except in time of elections when the candidate is strong, and this is the case of Gustavo Petro, and Gustavo Petro is not a party. He's a person. He's a professional politician that has run in elections since 1998, but he is not a party, and he's not backed up by an organization.
Wonderful. Who wants to go next? Who's ready?
Maybe I can say a few things. I would think that in general I would agree with the notion that the left has it looks more at this point as a charismatic movement that is also assembling a bunch of like grassroots organizations, social movements, some political parties. I think that we would have, I will have to wait and watch, at least in this next 4 years, because the project is still very young. I would think that there is both polarization and policy alignment. The thing is that since the peace and conflict debate has been so centered for so many rounds of presidential elections, Colombians are totally and not accustomed to having discussions regarding pensions, fiscal reform, the economic model. These things were mostly taken for granted. And in my opinion, this is the first time in which these topics are being seriously discussed. People, like 2 weeks ago, everybody started talking about pensions because that was the topic. And then 2 weeks prior, everybody was talking about whether textiles and clothes could be imported freely or not. These type of things that deal with the model of economic development, what to keep from neoliberalism and what to send away. I think that what is happening right now is that we are so new at having these discussions. This is so recent for Colombians, right? That things are just starting to get aligned around these topics. So if Gustavo Petro is offering policy Y with respect to pensions, like the other candidates, they haven't been thinking about this for 12 years. It's like for 2 weeks. So they have to come up with something. So this is the change in the master cleavage means that everything is very like new and hard to tackle and to define.
Wonderful. And none of you have time to answer this, but I'm puzzling through myself whether Colombia ever had debates about these policies since the National Front. The new cleavage was war and peace, but I'm not sure what the cleavage was before that, other than conservatives and liberals. But anyway, I turn this over now to Juan Pablo.
Bien, para cerrar. Yo
Just
creo
to
que
close off, I would like to say that
experimenta Colombia
what
en este momento
Colombia is living right now is some sort of normalization of, the tendency, because we have had an atypical kind of, run, exiting the conflict, what you've just said, Francis. But in that sense, I think this normalization is getting it closer to the Latin American debate, as you well said. I mean, it's really similar to the rest of the countries in Latin America, but it's difficult to establish precisely which of these countries. And I completely agree with what Monica mentioned at the beginning. Petrismo or Pacto, that's not the PT, there's no party, there's a coalition, that's exactly where we're at. A charismatic persona, you know, with different political orientations, social movements that represent the basis of his voters, right? That's what we are faced with. Another important point that I need to highlight in order to take into account here, and we also need to take into account in this election, is the fear towards Petro. I think in a way reappears that debate of Colombia becoming Venezuela, you know, as Steve said. But on the other hand, you know, the failure of Uke devastated him in that sense. And I think that of Duque, and that's why we find an unstable balance that is difficult to define, as Silvia said. And it's really difficult for me to compare Colombia with other countries right now because I can't find a similar thing electorally speaking. We'll see what happens when he wins, if he wins.
Wonderful. Well,
Maravilloso.
thank you all enough. And I want to do that on behalf of Steve Levitsky, who had to leave to teach, and then he's going to give a talk, and Alisha Holland, who organized this panel. So we are indebted to all of you. I've learned a lot. I know our audience has as well. And so we are very, very grateful, and we hope to see you all again soon at a Dr. Class event. And as far as the audience is concerned, we hope to see you all back here next week for our final session of the semester. And we're thrilled that we will have Victoria Paniagua, who will be here from the London School of Economics here. She'll be here virtually with us. And she will be speaking about ensuring against democracy, the political economy of pre-modern elite asset portfolio diversification. So we've been trying to get her for a while, so we're thrilled. And you can find a link to that in the chat that Jillian has just put in. Again, thanks to the Dr. Class staff, thanks to my co-organizers, and above all, thanks to our panelists who have so generously given of their time and have taught us so much about Colombian politics today. We'll be watching this election very closely, and we'll be thinking of you. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Until next week. Bye-bye.